Violence is not supposed to work in America. For no one, that is, except for the omnipotent administrator. But this is yet to be proved to my satisfaction, since I know that a bomb is a bomb is a bomb.
Yep. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in radical self-education.
We're just two guys meeting the nursery tale of the specter of communism and publishing a manifesto of our own.
Lovely. And this go-round, we are reading Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson.
Yes, George Jackson. He was born in 1941 in Chicago, Illinois, into the shadow of American racism. Growing up frequently involved in the juvenile system, at age 18, he was given a sentence of 1 year to life for the crime of stealing $70 from a gas station. During his tenure in some of California's worst prisons, he studied revolutionary thinkers and Marxian economics alike, transforming himself into a powerful, radical intellectual organizer and legend in the prison organizational system. As a member of the Black Panther Party, he advocated for armed resistance and preparedness for the kinds of conflicts that would ultimately tear the vanguard of the 60s and 70s apart. Despite his state-sanctioned execution during an escape attempt at the prison, his work goes on to inspire as a powerful call for revolutionary action today.
That's right. And we are reading Blood in My Eye, finished mere days before his execution at the hands of state pigs at San Quentin State Prison. Blood in My Eye is, much like his previous work, Soledad Brother, a collection of letters and essays written by George Jackson from prison. Blood in My Eye captures the tenacious, revolutionary spirit of George L. Jackson, with his fervor for defending the people from the evils of fascism leaping from every word on the page. Originally published in 1972, the book continues to be published against the wishes of the Jackson family. A free PDF is widely and readily available online for all to read.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with that. I saw a tweet from a relative or a descendant of his, and apparently he just signed some very dubious paperwork. Interestingly enough, the owner of the press...
Black Classic Press.
Yeah, Black Classic Press. Is Ta-Nehisi Coates' father.
Interesting.
So, very strange.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, got that from the same series of tweets. So, interesting stuff. What I was going to say is I read a bit about his death, and he got a gun into the prison. Basically, it was either handed to him during a visit, or he had smuggled it in different parts and built it. But a guard saw it in his hat or in his hair or something like that, and he just pulled it out and was like, "This is it! This is it!" And they shot his ass. It sucks.
That all kind of sounds like bullshit to me, to be honest.
Yeah.
I know that he died a mere 2 weeks after his brother, his younger brother, about whom he speaks quite often in this book. 2 weeks later, his poor mother having to deal with the loss of two sons in the span of 2 weeks. But it all sounds like bullshit to me, to be honest. The verdict came down. Guards, I know that they had just opened this new open-air rec facility or whatever at San Quentin.
Yeah.
And they seemingly intentionally let a certain group of black prisoners and a certain group of white prisoners out. A fight started between those two groups of prisoners. A guard killed 4 of them.
Yeah.
And the verdict in the case about these dead prisoners came out, and then within 30 minutes of that verdict, a guard was killed. Not the one that pulled the trigger, but a guard was killed, and George Jackson was one of the people accused of murdering this guard. And it was in the kerfuffle around that he supposedly died.
Yeah.
So this thing about a gun, it seems, it's not obviously outside of the wheelhouse of George Jackson to have planned something like that, but it all seems a little sus to me.
Further review is necessary, as per usual. Regardless, I know a lot of the prisoners sign an affidavit afterwards saying something about his involvement. So I think it's really just telling how he was so radicalized by his experience living, just being alive from birth. I mean, I had said in the intro he was living in the shadow of racism because it really informed his entire worldview. I mean, it's impossible to deny that his experience as being black in America really empowered his thinking.
Yeah, being poor and black. He even opens the book that way. Not to just immediately jump into it.
No, by all means. There's a lot to get into here.
It's this line here where he says the black revolutionary is twice doomed.
Twice doomed, yeah, exactly.
The idea being that his his death is foregone, and he seemed to recognize that from a very early age. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously, he was imprisoned when he was, 17? I know that wasn't the first time he was arrested.
Yeah.
I think he was imprisoned for the $70 gas station robbery. I think he was 17 when that
Okay.
happened.
Yeah, I thought it was 17 or 18. So
Yeah.
one thing that was really powerful to me at the end, he says, like, they can only execute me once.
Mm-hmm.
He just really had a lot to say. I mean,
I'll just say from the outset, every single person should read this book.
oh, yeah.
If you are of the revolutionary persuasion, if you are of the anti-capitalist persuasion, I don't even think you need to be revolutionary to recognize everything great about this book. And hopefully, if you are of the anti-capitalist but non-revolutionary persuasion, this book will be the thing that pushes you over that line, because it is transformative. It's just such an edifying work.
Yes.
I think this has been the book of this project for me so far.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly powerful. It's an incredible call to action and immediate action. It has organizational notes. It talks about a lot of things. It talks about a very present situation in America, one that I think is still completely applicable to today. It talks about a circumstance after a revolution has failed, what is required. And it talks about it in so many ways. I think it's as just a culmination of everything we've been reading so far. It's a very powerful message to read. And I mean, there was part of it that was almost like transformative to my thinking, because it really is like it's an impatient work. You know, he says, like, we don't have time to wait. You know, we don't have time to sit around. We don't have 150 years. Like, they ask us to be patient for 150 years is what he says. And it's like, we are being executed right now. Our choice is revolution now or death. Right? It's like socialism or barbarism, you know?
Yeah, he calls to that Fanon quote quite often, which I don't remember exactly, but to paraphrase is basically like, it's no longer time to talk, it's time to act. He calls on that all of the time.
Yeah. So I love when he invokes that quote, because he's talking to his brother and he's saying, remember, we're calling for organized violence. Like, you can't be so drastic, like you can't, it's like he was actually being like a bit more of a moderating voice there, and then his brother is like, no, the time for action is now. And I'm sure we'll end up talking about him, but his movement, which George Jackson talks about frequently here, was really intense.
The August 7th movement.
Yeah, the August 7th movement. You know, there's a lot in this book. You know, how long of a game is too long? The purpose of this project is ultimately revolution, and we're aware that the building of socialism, like the building of communism, is a long-term project. But I think in some people it's a treatment of... it allows a bit of, pushing away of responsibility, like kind of like you talked about before, like the intellectualizing of communism. It's like, actually, there is action in this plan, in this project. There's action to be had.
For sure. I think we'll get into that a little bit more. And I'm sorry that I always call to James Baldwin, especially when we're talking about black writers, it seems. But Baldwin was another kind of transformative thinker for me. And so I think often about my initial reaction to things that Baldwin had to say or things that Baldwin wrote when we're reading these black revolutionary writers again. And Baldwin also very famously said, like, it took my grandfather's time, it took my father's time, it took my brother's time. How much time do you need, you know?
Yeah. Just to give us a quote here on page 6, he's talking about Muhammad Ali and says, he says, ain't nobody but black folks going to die in the revolution. But this argument completely overlooks the fact that we've always done most of the dying and still do. The dying is what's at stake through social neglect or in U.S. foreign wars. Right? I even love in the next line, the point is now to construct a situation where someone else will join in the dying.
Join in the dying, yeah.
It's like there are people on the line one way or the other.
Well, this is the same experience that I had reading Black Power by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, because I've mentioned on this podcast many times before that I'm a reformed pacifist. And reading Black Power, along with that section from Conditions of the Working Class in England from Engels, opened my eyes to the fact that, like, murder is happening, death is happening all of the time. And it's just happening through social neglect. It's happening through the machinations of the ruling class, rather, the signing of a pen rather than the firing of a gun kind of thing. And that was just so eye-opening for me. This was, 4 or 5 years ago at this point that I really had that revelation. And now I see that same sentiment throughout this book, and can't disagree.
Yeah. I just want to preface this because he talks about some increasingly radical things. I love when he says, like, I am an extremist. I am a communist. I am going to be destroyed. But the more of this stuff we read, I find it harder and harder to argue with these kinds of arguments, like this immediate call for action is definitely, not only is it empowering, but it's also a little terrifying to think, like, ultimately thinking about, how long is too long? It's like, what's the end goal of this project, right? Is the only thing I'm going to be able to do is join a small, quick urban militia and that kind of thing?
Well, honestly, a lot of my questions around this book are wrestling with those same sorts of difficult to face realities,
right?
Those truths. And I mean, fuck it. Let's just can we jump ahead?
By all means. That was just my very first Post-it note, and I think it ties into a lot of my feelings about this book, a lot of what this book kind of invoked in me.
Yeah, well, I'm going to kind of try to put a few things together here. I'm going to start on page 77.
All right.
First of all, I will say I think the opening letter/essay was the most powerful one to me. I also do think his description of fascism is really useful and would probably be very, very useful for helping to educate and or radicalize people on the left around what fascism actually looks like in the United States.
Right.
That all to say, a lot of my quotes are going to come from like the first 90 pages because it was the most powerful to me.
For sure.
But on page 77 near the bottom, he says, if history is our guide, it clearly records that nothing of any great value has ever changed hands without a struggle, or at least a show of or threat of violence. Men simply don't surrender what they think of as their privilege and property except by force. History itself is economically motivated class struggle.
Yeah.
And at that point in the book, I was already deep enough into... I read all of the first 90 pages in one sitting just because it's such a page turner. And I usually like to parse out our reading little by little so I have time to think about it between passages or whatever. But I was just so taken by it. And by the time I got to this passage in the book, I was already thinking a lot about the quote-unquote professional revolutionary.
Yes.
And the Vanguard Party. He very clearly states that the Black Panther Party is the Vanguard Party and intends for the Black Panther Party to be motivated and act as the vanguard for communist revolution in the United States. But he also says a couple of other things wrapped around this kind of tense conflict of what is my role in this? What are the options here? Am I really going to become a member of an urban militia? And you know what I mean? These sorts of questions that one asks.
Yeah.
If we flip back to page 20, he's talking about the political branch of the party and the armed branch of the party, essentially. He says there should be one branch that is purely political, operating all of these things like rent strikes, breakfast programs, etc., effectively establishing dual power.
Yes.
And there should be an armed branch, the super secret branch that enforces it. The military, the comrades that make the best use of the M60, the M16, the flamethrowers. So he's very clearly delineating some lines here. But both of those, in my opinion, are professional revolutionaries. They just take a different kind of role in what a professional revolutionary is supposed to do, right? But the question that was lingering in my mind that I've really been wrestling with over the last week that we've read this book, if one is unable, for whatever reason, say unable, unwilling, whatever, to join the vanguard, what is their role then?
Sure.
If I'm not ready to become a militant because I'm not trained, I'm too comfortable, whatever, you know what I mean? If I'm not ready, what is the role then? He even says at one other point that, basically everyone should do what they're good at doing.
Right, yeah.
In service of the party and in service of the revolution.
Where he's talking about unity.
Yeah, and that's my question. How can one's skill or knowledge be put to use in that sort of way? Because, there are things that I can do.
Right.
As an educator, as a laborer, as a woodworker,
sure.
There are things that are useful, skills that I have. If I'm not ready to join the vanguard, what is the option? You know what I mean? I feel like that's a big open question for me in the book.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I really love his construction of the ideal party, and what it really makes me think of is how reflected is that structure in any of the parties that we have today. I mean, he calls for 3 branches on page 43. I like his structure here where he says, there's a psychological effect of our secret army, an increasingly pervasive underground press with a new emphasis on the mass style, both of these under the direction of an ultra-aggressive political party. Mm-hmm. So, he clearly has a call for a separation between a distinctly militant branch, and one that might be a little more above ground. And I think, when you're saying what can the regular person maybe do? I think it exists within that political structure.
Yeah.
It's just that I think that his emphasis on the militancy of it comes from his complete acknowledgement of the fact that repression is inevitable. That's really a big part of his thing. It's like, as we've heard many times now, it's like this kind of militancy is the last possible action. All other methods have been tried. Everything else all other possibility has been extinguished. Like, this is really our last chance. Because it's coming from real world action. This is based on largely the experience of the Black Panther Party. There's one point where he even says, like, even the children's breakfast programs haven't been spared. There is a requirement that there is a structure there to do what he calls counterterrorism against the repression of the police.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that, as uncomfortable as it is, it's like, once you set out on this project, right, that kind of clash with the status quo structures of power is inevitable. Because what you're trying to do is seize some of that power from someone who has the monopoly on power.
Yeah, he talks about it a lot, like you are basically making the decision to become an outlaw because you recognize that all revolutionary action is inherently going to be illegal.
Yeah, exactly. He makes it very clear. It's like any steps you take in this pathway are basically going to be viewed as illegal.
Yeah.
And I think that that's just a really incredibly powerful message. It's something that just has to be taken to heart. Even if you're, like, set out to do the most legal thing possible, it will find a way to be attacked.
Well, you brought up repression, and there are a couple of bits about repression that I wanted to point out.
Sure.
Starting on 23, this is where he first brings up repression. He says, "Do you see the effect that repression has on the uncommitted? Comrade, repression exposes. By drawing violence from the beast, the vanguard party is demonstrating for the world to examine just exactly what terms their rule is predicated on, their power to organize violence, our acquiescence."
Yeah.
And he kind of builds this over the next few pages as well. He also says on 25 that repression it has to be a part of the revolutionary process, a necessary stage in the development of revolutionary consciousness.
Yeah.
In large part because it's really just forcing the ruling class to show their hand. Revolutionary action forces them into a reactive state of repression, which will ultimately bring to light consciousness among the masses.
Yes, I think that that's something that ultimately makes his argument here so powerful. Not only is he acknowledging that repression is abound, right? Not only is he saying that repression is going to happen, you have to be armed. On top of that, he's laying out the fact that we are building parallel structures because when those structures are attacked, the more infused that parallel structure is into the mass of people, right, into the mass power base, the more the attacks on our structures become attacks on the people. He's saying that this is a necessary step if we're talking about class consciousness raising. It's not just pamphleting. It's not just going out there into the rally. It's also saying, like, how can we develop this kind of organizational structure that can then tie the repression that we are inevitably going to experience to the people? Because if you're receiving that repression and your power levels are low, you're doomed. But, like, if you're actually building up a base of power among the people, then you don't actually have to do the violence at the end of the day. I mean, he's clear that there will be violence happening, but he even says, like, we can limit the amount of violence that happens to this in the revolution by mobilizing as many people as possible.
Yeah.
Because a mass of people carries with it a threat of violence.
Yeah.
If the police realizes that they have to deal with 200,000 people in a march, that's much more powerful than, like, a sect of 5,000 people even, or a community, or even like a vanguard of a certain amount of people. It's about the threat of a mass populace, and that's exactly what the kind of people's war that George Jackson is advocating for relies on,
Yeah. He even says on 29, the only effective challenge to power is one that is broad enough to make isolation impossible, intensive enough to cause repression to affect the normal lifestyle of as many members as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to show the people that it's going to affect their treats, man. You can't, there's anti-treat action, anti-treat accelerationism in here. We have to blow up the trade lines. Not literally whoever's listening.
Yeah, that actually kind of brings me to, you'd already kind of brought up adventurism in his letters to his younger brother, Joe.
Yeah.
And he has a lot to say about that.
That was one of my points, too, just before we go on, was something I had wrote down when he talks about FOCO theory, the idea of small militant squadrons, quick moving squadrons that can do these kind of hit and run attacks, that can do counterterrorism against the repression of the police state, that kind of thing.
Limited selective violence, he calls it.
Yeah, exactly. Organized, intentional violence against the pig class. He gives a long list of why these kinds of attacks are valuable, what their purpose is. I think it's very well argued in a very guerrilla war way, right? He's talking about making the forces of the state spread itself thin, expend needlessly on its endless gadgets, right? One thing I love, he talks about how the mechanical structure of the state is actually its weakness because it relies on being large. It relies on having this massive force and all of these expensive gadgets, when in reality, a $100,000 tank can be disposed of with $2 worth of material.
Yep.
He talks a lot about very, maybe a little too organizational notes on the kind of violence that we might see in the streets if we intend to create these small revolutionary brigades, right? This militant cadre. And that's quite nice. And I lost track there, but hold on, because I am going to pull this back. The thought that I had in my mind, though, was like, what distinguishes that kind of violence from terrorism, adventurism, right? Putschism, blanquism, like all of these things that we've been warned of in the past. I know that the answer lies in the organization, but I'm just curious more so it's like, how really do you determine what kind of counterterrorism is required?
Yeah, what qualifies as something that is part of this limit of selective violence versus something that's just adventuristic or whatever?
Yeah, because even when it comes to the August 7th movement, right, when I read that initially, I was like, damn, dude, that's a crazy way to go. For, if you haven't read the book, it's Jonathan Jackson basically goes and arms 5 prisoners. He goes and offers guns to these prisoners at a courthouse.
Yeah.
And then they take a judge and jurors hostage, and then they try to make an escape, and they're all mowed down, the judge and the jury included. And when I read that initially, I was like, damn, that's a crazy way to go. And I felt kind of put off by that. But when George Jackson talks about it in the end of the book here, or near the end, he makes it sound really, like, incredibly well-intentioned. He's saying, like, out of 5 men, we offered them their freedom, and 3 of them took the chance. What does that show, really? Think of those 5 men as, like, a massive populace, right? All of the people at the bottom rungs of reality, if 3 of them take the gun, that's really all I can say about that, right? Like, he makes it sound so much more inspiring than my brother got gunned down by the police.
Yeah, there was a quote I was looking for, basically about the willingness of the state to throw collateral damage to the wind for the sake of repression. Because, like, the August 7th movement is a perfect example of that. They didn't kill 5 men who were prisoners trying to break away and escape. They killed fucking everyone. There's something really, really powerful in that from the standpoint of raising consciousness, raising class consciousness, and a recognition of the fascist state that already exists in the United States, and the willingness of the state power to fucking throw you to the wind.
Right. What a message that is. Not only did they get the people that were there to incite the violence, right, the people that you, the bystander, might thumb your nose at, they killed the onlookers too. They killed the jurors.
Yep.
They also killed a portion of the state itself. They killed the judge. There's so much symbolism in that movement there. I think that it's way more righteous for George Jackson to use it in this sense. I think it validates itself the way that he puts it there. This is the kind of sincere revolutionary theory that people say is lacking today. This is like a very sober analysis of what is necessary in the day, the 60s and the 70s. I mean, like, where is this kind of thing today? Where is this today?
Yeah, I don't see any thought leaders today that had this kind of fervor.
Yeah.
That also, I mean, I've called them charismatic leaders in the past, and I suppose maybe there's something problematic in that, but I don't see people galvanizing the masses in the same sort of way with the same sort of plain spoken, clear rhetoric.
It's insane to me that George Jackson was able to achieve this level of self-emancipation, basically.
Yeah.
Like, he was raging against the system all the way up until his death, and it's because how was he able to get these books? Like, that's a big question in my mind, man. He spent 11 years in jail Where did the books come from?
Yeah.
Who even printed them? Like, that shit is crazy to me.
Well, his comrade in prison, the one that everyone says was most responsible for radicalizing him, is the one that turned him on to, I know, Mao specifically. Yeah. So that doesn't answer the question. It just changes the direction of the question. Sure. Is where did he get the books?
Where did the books come from, man?
William Nelson.
He was incredibly well read.
Yeah, he was.
It's clear. I mean, I wasn't expecting like historical analysis here. Okay, he's not shooting from the hip. I feel that he is quite well researched. Mm-hmm. The only thing he doesn't do is have footnotes, man. But that's because this is written in jail.
Yeah.
This is a series of letters. We were talking about the organizational structure.
Yeah, I mean, based on where we were at, I kind of want to jump to 55.
Yeah.
Because I think the criticism you're going to hear most from people about this book, or maybe the Black Panther Party in general, is the people's adherence to nonviolence and their discomfort around the idea of revolutionary violence being on the table. Reactionaries can respond to the idea of revolutionary violence with disdain, and it distances them from the argument altogether. But on the top of 55, Jackson tells us we must, in all haste, transcend the intellectual inhibitions that preclude support of at least the minimum level of violence that must develop concomitantly with each political thrust. Our attitudes must change before we can expect any response from the people, the workers, the students, the lumpen proletariat. So, like, we have to let go of nonviolence.
Yeah.
And it is only as thought leaders in that way can we even begin to start moving the masses forward.
I love on page 29, he just says it so clearly here. Can power seriously be challenged without a response? Will the robber baron, the tycoon, the Führer allow us to seize his privilege without resistance? Can we steal it away from the greatest bandit of all time with sleight of hand alone?
Yeah.
You know, incredible. The fascists understand the value of mass psychology, are familiar with its use, and hold all the important implements of its effective control, but they're not aware of our existence and our general strategy regarding the reaching of the people. It's like they are aware of us. Even as Marx said in the manifesto, it's like the great powers already acknowledge communism as a threat. We know that.
Yeah.
Right? And you should too. You should too. If that doesn't inform your strategy, then you're doing the wrong strategy.
Exactly. Yeah, Kwame Ture famously said, I'm not going to remember it exactly, but nonviolence only works when your aggressor has a conscience.
Yeah.
You know, the United States has none.
Yeah. We are the most advanced capitalist nation out there. Of course, they will defend itself.
Yeah.
You know, that's a given. And he's very clear. You know, he understands that people are discomforted with the idea of protracted people's war. That was like one of the first things I said on this podcast, is that I was like, man, I really hope that a prolonged guerrilla struggle with a terrible fascist power isn't the ultimate answer to this question. And it's like, of course it is. Of course it is.
Yeah.
Of course it is. So, like, what do you do?
That question, though, is wrapped up with my entire frame of thinking around this book, because it's a weird space to exist in. It's a purgatorial space to exist in, where I 100% agree with his conclusion, but I'm just uncomfortable with it. You know what I mean? And it's like, the reasons I'm uncomfortable are indications of my own privilege and my own comfort, for sure.
Selfish and liberal. You know, I'm the first to acknowledge that.
But
here we are. Yeah.
So what is the alternative then? The uncomfortable answer is there isn't one.
No. If I'm thinking about what the fuck I'm doing with the future, I mean, I'm not just reading all this shit to ingratiate myself. Like, again, it's like, when do we hit the mattresses, man? Like, that's a fucking question.
Yeah. Can we flip way to the end of the book on 187?
Absolutely.
Because he kind of has something to say about this. Jackson writes, "Those who have more regard for their own egos or self-interest than they have for building a united, progressive left, and those who abandon community altogether in favor of petty interests, are in direct opposition to our real interests." And I gotta say, like, it's really fucking hard to read that and feel hit by it. I've been talking to my wife about this quite a lot this week while reading this book, and all of these uncomfortable feelings that have been festering and kind of bubbling in the cauldron of my soul under the surface. Yeah. Because I don't know what to do, how to respond to these kind of dyspeptic feelings inside. And she said something to the effect of, you have people that love and rely on you. And it's a disservice to those people to abandon all of that. And she's also not wrong, you know, but that exacerbates this feeling of listlessness, this feeling of like of being lost and the understanding of what to do to move forward then.
Yeah, you know, I'm not trying to like personalize the revolutionary struggle here or anything like that, but there can be a sense of failure to understand what steps need to be taken that I think can impact yourself as how you're feeling just in your life. Regardless of how you're doing and what you're doing currently, there's a weight here that's like, I know what ultimately will make this world a better place, or at least I really truly believe that in what steps need to be taken. We have plenty of organizational notes on what it's going to take. We understand and acknowledge the costs, the causes, all of that. And the inability to make any movement on it, I think, can really be something that is diminishing, you know, and that's a real struggle. There's a note that's both positive and negative, though, in the future, right? And it comes from part of what lends itself so much to Jackson's writing is the fact that he talks about the Black experience as the fact that they're being exterminated. You know, that's what gives such power to his words, is that he needs action now to save as many people as he can. The sooner you organize, the more people you organize, the less violence will ultimately be required. And to Jackson, what that means is less people will die. Okay? Less violence will had to be halved.
Have to be hot.
Yes. That's exactly what he says. It comes from the fact that black people were under imminent threat. They were still under the imminent threat of racism and the racist structure because they were allowed to live. And in fact, I think that the contradiction between the freedom of movement in this Jim Crow structure versus the fact that they're ultimately oppressed by the everyday experience, not even the explicit state structures alone, but just every aspect of their surroundings is oppressing to them. They're told that they're free, they're told that it's equality now, but they're not seeing that in the actions of their lives. Like, that kind of threat is really what spurred this kind of revolutionary fervor, especially in the Black Panther Party. And in the future, that same kind of threat is arising in the fact that the climate is killing us, right? Not to be a fucking big eco head again, because that's what I boil down to at the end of the day. But there is on the horizon an existential threat that will force people to reckon with their situation, right? Something that ultimately affects everyone's comfort, whether they like it or not. So the thing is, if we're building these organizational structures around people's survival ultimately, which is what he's saying the parallel structures need to do, their survival structures, the survival of the revolutionary institutions, I think more and more people will be affected to the point where they have to act. So many people, especially in America, are able to do nothing because they're comfortable. I mean, that's part of our dread, you know, our comfort. We don't want it to be affected. As hard as that is to admit, it's like I sit on my ass and play video games a lot, and I, you know, get to enjoy the fruits of my white privilege, you know, and the dread comes from the fact that I don't want to give that up.
Yeah, I think there's this discomfort with recognizing a misalignment of justice. Like, we can look outward of ourselves, look outside of ourselves, and recognize that everyone deserves a level of comfort that they are not being afforded. And it's hard to recognize that and reconcile it with, like, the loss of my comfort, my personal comfort, that it will require to hopefully someday, probably not in my lifetime, see that comfort afforded to everyone. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to give up one's own comfort when the goal is for everyone to be as comfortable as you.
You know, but the thing that, just to bring it back to my ultimate point here, is that there is something that will ultimately affect everyone's comfort, and it's the climate. You know, on page 73, I'm not going to read this full quote, but it's the entire bottom paragraph. He says,
why don't you want to read the full quote?
I wonder why. Aaron. Why can't we wait until the generation that thinks racistly has been educated away? I paraphrase that just to be completely open. Okay? It may be the reverse, that we are blown away first. Or if we survive, what will we inherit?
A desert?
Yeah, a desert. That's really it. It's much harder. It gets harder and harder with every news cycle to not think of the future as the world of Fallout.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about a nuclear desert here. Not anything good. So if that's the future, you know, like if we have to wait for the bombs to drop to build the fucking utopia commune, then what the fuck is the point? That's why it's action now. That's why the time is right now. And now more than ever. Not now in 1972 when George Jackson wrote this, but now, yesterday. That's what makes this message so powerful to me. That's my positive negative note. That same kind of existential threat that made the Black Panther Party so revolutionary is coming. So it's on us, the vanguard, to organize that.
That's true. That is the ultimate question then, is how do you galvanize people around that clearly impending existential threat?
Yeah.
I mean, he uses the lens of race to kind of talk about that a little bit. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Absolutely.
On page 11, he says, talking about how black folks are inordinately marginalized by capitalism. He says, however, if we are ever going to be successful in tying black energy and rage to the international socialist revolution, we must understand that racial complexities do exist.
Yeah.
Now, first that jumped out to me while I was reading this because we've already talked a little bit about this on the show, but this dismissal of race or sexuality or other forms of identity, quote unquote, identity politics, being dismissed as like not relevant to the context of class warfare, where obviously they are, and they create their own complexities within the conversation around class warfare. But reading this specifically, it got me thinking about there is an overwhelming consciousness within the black community about racism, around racism, around how racism impacts black folks. They recognize that.
Yeah.
But there's something missing with taking the final step, the next stage of that thinking, to recognize how that is intertwined with capitalism, the oppressive nature of capitalism. And that's kind of his question that he's raising there. Like, how do we get that consciousness, that awareness of racism that exists within what he calls the black colony, to then move toward and be directed toward the international socialist revolution? Because there are racial complexities within that revolution, but that's also something that can be galvanized, a people that can be moved because they already recognize some form of its oppression.
Yeah, I love that he talks about it on page 36. He's talking about collaborators, essentially race traitors, so to speak. He says he hates them more than he hates the sheriff or the owner, in quotes. I love that he says they have to know that when they attack socialism, the communist ideal, and revolution, that they're not logically attacking all that is white. These black men have had time to study. Some have traveled. They know that it was capitalist agricultural economics that first caused our pain. And that the only change since then is the decline of the agricultural elite and the rise of the modern bourgeoisie.
A sweatshop displaced the plantation.
That's exactly right. You know, it's like even thinking about the way that we're tied economically to rent seekers, that is modern day slavery. We don't even have the option to live without being tied economically to the systems of capitalism. You know, you have no option to live except to sell your labor either. Like, that's to see slavery as an extension of that through the context of at what at the time was an agricultural system, you know, and then has it developed into an industrial system, I think is quite natural. It's just, how do you make people then take that step further and say, now we need to destroy those relations?
Yeah. That actually kind of comes back to a quote way back at the beginning on 7, where he says that he is a slave of property.
Yeah.
That slavery is just transitioned. He says, born to a premature death, a menial subsistence wage worker, odd job man, the cleaner, the caught, the man under hatches without bail, that's me, the colonial victim. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow.
Yes.
Anyone who passed the civil service examination yesterday can kill me today with complete immunity. I've lived with repression every moment of my life, a repression so formidable that any movement on my part can only bring relief, the respite of a small victory, or the release of death. In every sense of the term, in every sense that's real, I'm a slave to and of property. It's just this transference, this development that has happened.
Yeah.
He's recognizing, connecting the dots between the economic side of slavery, that capitalism was at play, and to see that that is still the case. Even if there is supposed emancipation, he is still a slave to property.
Yeah, I mean, you got to hand it to George Jackson. He just has a really amazing understanding of the development of the relations between property and people. And I think it even comes back when he talks about fascism as the evolution of property relations later on. I mean, it's very straightforward. And like I said earlier, it gets harder and harder to argue with.
I would like to talk a little bit about individualism.
Yeah.
This is going to take us to page 102.
Okay.
To start. He says, one can quietly refuse to accept the constrictions of bourgeois culture, can reject himself, hate the self, and turn inward. By doing so, he accomplishes a form of individual revolt. But here again, we find another unconscious manifestation of the thing we hate, individualism, a now attitudinal instrumentality of bourgeois culture. And I gotta say, that's another one that was kind of hit me like a gut punch, because as we've said before on the podcast, the first revolution is a revolution of the mind.
Yeah.
And that revolution has to happen within oneself. So there is an important stage that has to happen on an individual level, but when that is happening in isolation, without community, without organizing, etc., whatever, there's a part of it that feels kind of futile. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't logically follow with the next step being, and here's how I will participate in whatever is necessary for this to move forward. Because, there's a futility in sympathy for the revolution.
Yeah.
And not being a member of the revolution. And I feel kind of stuck in the sympathy part.
He talks a lot about people being willing to just look on, like they get their gratification from just looking on as the Vanguard gets destroyed.
Yeah.
And I think that plays a big part of it. There's a way he talks about almost the revolutionizing of the individual, because ultimately we have to free the individual from individuality. The success of all leads to the success of one, because that's the goal, right? Is once people take those ultimate steps and we're free from the restrictions of class antagonisms, then people can truly lend their energy to whatever they want. I mean, because what they will want is what society needs, And in the highest phase, that really can be as abstracted as we need, because we're talking about post-scarcity, that ideal, right? I mean, even if you don't want to get into this kind of techno-optimistic weird fantasy, gay
Star
space
Trek?
future communism, Star Trek style shit. Yeah, that's exactly right. Say we just come to a cruising altitude, we come to a maintenance level, a pacification of nature, a coexistence with man. I mean, that kind of life is beautiful. You cook in the afternoons, hunt in the evenings, and drink at night, discuss with your friends, all that. That's a different kind of individualism at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeking when we're talking about individualism is still ultimately our goal. It's just that the expression of that individualism in the current is an expression of our power. It's an expression of exploitation, ultimately, because the power comes from the privilege wrought by the exploitation of others. We're coasting on the backs of what's already been built, and it was built on slavery. So I think that that's really what it gets down to here.
Well, the irony, and this is more related to my thought and less to yours,
Sure.
so sorry for
No, you're fine.
just being a fucking wall. The irony of the kind of condemnation of that individualism that comes from revolution of the mind in isolation is that this is coming from George Jackson, who spent the majority of his life in prison and was, as you already said, a self-emancipated, self-educated Marxist, communist. Right. All of that came from his own doing, his own will, his own kind of sense of his own drive. It didn't come from without. And he was limited in what he could do with it, obviously, because he was confined mostly in solitary for 10, 11 years, whatever it was that he was in prison. Yeah.
I mean, he still did a lot, though, is the thing. Is that he was well known in the prison system. I mean, for the prison organizational movement, that wasn't nothing. Oh, you know what? Just want to talk about on page 32. Might be a little topical. One thing that we have going for us: all reactionary movements depend principally on a handful of individuals, sometimes just one individual. There are many thousands of ways to correct individuals, but the best is to send one armed expert.
Yep.
I just think there's something to that, right? We talked about being against adventurism, being against terrorism, but man, if you want to stop a movement, you cut the head off the snake and the body dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
What can I say? There are many ways. People die every day. They drown, they get poleaxed, they breathe noxious gases, they get stabbed, they get poisoned. There's a lot. But a curse won't work.
Yeah. It's hard to read this and not contextualize it in the lens of Luigi Mangione at this point, because yes, his politics were quite messy, it would appear, and no, his adventurism didn't do anything to change healthcare in the United States, at least not currently. I mean, United Healthcare just named their next CEO. Nonetheless, like, it's hard to read this and not put it in that context, right? And I think the conversation around Luigi's Mansion is an interesting one to think of, because it is, on one hand, seemingly a pretty galvanizing thing that is helping to raise class consciousness. I think that's pretty undeniable. On the other hand, it didn't do a whole lot to change anything systemically at this point anyway. And so, like, I don't know, it's the idea that one armed expert can solve these sorts of problems, so to speak, I think is a little fraught.
Well, something that George Jackson says here is that there needs to be a structure ready to explain the actions of the person, right? There needs to be something that's there to do that.
The political arm,
right,
as opposed to the military arm.
That's exactly it. While Luigi represents a military action that might be taken, it's not that he didn't have a spokesperson that was like, actually, I did this because, he had a manifesto, maybe, allegedly.
Bullshit. Yeah.
We'll see. But that's the thing. It's like, we're still lacking the structure. We're lacking the party to do the work that is required for the action of the deed, the propaganda of the deed to be effective, and I'm still not advocating for terrorism. I'm still not advocating for that exact style of action, perhaps of correction. But I think it's something that lends credence to Jackson's argument, because up to this point, we've talked about this aplenty. We've said that repression is bound to happen and you need to be armed. Lenin says that. In fact, he has a huge Lenin drop on page 78. He says, blacks who seriously advocate revolution are killed. Blacks who attack property relations are slated for the graveyard or the prison camp. It's a national cultural tradition. Since these are the facts, it follows that, and then immediately a block quote, an oppressed class which does not strive to learn to use arms, to acquire arms, only deserves to be treated like slaves. We cannot forget, unless we become bourgeois pacifists or opportunists, that we are living in a class society. There is no way out of society, and there can be none except by means of class struggle. A direct quote from Lenin. We all acknowledge that, okay? But it's not a down-the-road proposition. That's what George Jackson's saying. It's a right-now thing. Mm-hmm. Any action you take will be met with repression, and in order for us to survive, in order for the vanguard to remain whole, which he acknowledges is the biggest setback, right? How can we ensure that the vanguard survives at all? Is to have an effective arm of counter-repression, okay? And there will be discussion, there will be a debate as to what that actually entails. There will be some strategy that has to go into that.
He says immediately after both of these two quotes that you're pointing at, on 33, we're going to have to fight to win. The logic of procrastination has been destroyed. A people can never be so repressed that they can't strike back in some way.
Yeah, I love that quote.
Yeah, and then right after that Lenin quote, he says, the vanguard cannot stay alive long enough to affect a broad consciousness unless it possesses the latent threat of force. And nor will I advocate for this level of adventurism or terrorism of the, quote, one-armed expert. However, we also recognize that this is exactly the way the state has repressed the Black Panther Party in particular.
Yes. Oh, my God. When he says, it's a horrible bit of foreshadowing on page 173. It hit me like a brick through a window. He says here, there's little of this consciousness among middle classes, so the first terror came from specially formed and hired goons, the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, the Black Legion, the FBI. They destroyed the already disintegrating vanguard, leaving the degenerate elements of the working class as the only available mass. And I was like, yeah, and then they did it again. And then they did it again. And then they did it again.
Yep.
And then they did it again.
The deeper and deeper into the book you get, the more you recognize his acceptance that he's a doomed man, that it's a foregone conclusion that to be a revolutionary means you will be taken down.
Yes.
And there's something that's like so sad about that, obviously, but he knew what he was doing. He knew exactly with whom he was dealing.
The Fuhrer, dude, the fucking fascists. Like, that's really it. And he even talks about it because we might have to circle back to this as like a whole category, but he really has a strong call for unity. As he already talked about, like, from each his ability, like, he's really saying we need to stop thinking about a single ideological line and we need to bring all forces forward right now. We keep arguing about a definition of fascism. We need to acknowledge that fascism is here and ready and it needs to be acted against immediately, yesterday, because even that kind of conversation is a waste of our time and energy and organization. Are they fascists? Like, are they Nazis? Are they any... who gives a fuck? Okay, we are dying in the streets. Okay, that's what George Jackson's saying here. We're being gunned down by the pigs. They're rolling the tanks through our streets. They're burning down our headquarters. They're murdering our people. They're preventing our programs where we feed the children, right? Where we ensure that children, the future of our country, get all the growing nutrition that they need. The police are coming in and stopping us and murdering us for that.
Yep.
That kind of discussion is over, and it was over 50 years ago. Action now. It keeps coming back to that point. This is a book that is calling for action.
100%. And the willingness of the state apparatus to, like you said, disarm a fucking lunch program, a breakfast program.
Yeah.
He says on 135, we will not succeed until we fully accept the fact that the enemy is aware, determined, disguised, totalitarian, and mercilessly counter-revolutionary.
Yes.
That's it. So much of the section about fascism felt very much ripped from the pages of January 2025 because that is so much of the discourse that's happening. And it's all fucking useless.
Right.
Like, did Elon give the Nazi salute or not? Who fucking cares? He's a fascist. We've all known it from day one. Like, determining if it... I don't know. It's
he
just
would stomp on your head if he could, if it meant more profits for his company. Even the next line, I really love that quote you just read. Aware, determined, disguised, totalitarian, and mercilessly counter-revolutionary. But it says there, our insistence on the military action has nothing to do with romanticism or precipitous idealistic fervor. Like, we're not just armed because it looks cool to wear the hats and the leather coats and all of that and to walk the streets with the guns. Like, it's not about that at all. It's about the fact that we want to live.
Yeah.
Right?
It does look cool, though.
It does look cool, though. It does look cool. There's got to be something cooler than leather. Leather's too fascist. Okay, sorry.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, buddy. Okay, buddy, pal, vegan. What else you got? What else you got here?
Well, I mean, I suppose now is as good a time as any to bring up this quote on 72.
Sure.
At the top, he says, the warnings that our thrusts towards self-determination will bring on fascism are irresponsible, or better, unrealistic. The fascists already have power.
Yeah.
It's just the continuation of the same thought. When I was reading this, I wrote Inauguration Day 2025, because that is reactionary resistance liberals or whatever are talking about, like, fascism is on the way, that sort of thing. And it's just like, how much of our energy are we going to spend on this part? Like, it's so evidently here. It's not on the horizon. It's under your feet.
You know, if the peaceful transfer of power to fascism, like, if you're willing to peacefully transfer power to fascism and say that peaceful transfer of power is part of your tradition, then it has always been fascist.
Mic drop. Exactly. Then it has always been fascist, and you are a fascist.
Yeah. It goes back to the beginning. The revolution that we had in this country was to change our property relations. You know, it was for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, the slave-owning class. I mean, my God, you know, America is the ultimate culmination of fascism in that sense. It is the economic configuration, right? It is the configuration of the economic forces and this kind of crazy patriotic, ultranationalistic, broad, massive appeal, right? This mass cult behind America is inherently fascist. You know, I keep fucking, I feel like I'm at the fucking stand right now. This shit'll drive you crazy. Like, I feel crazy ranting about it.
Well, it's like what we were talking about in the last episode around the manifesto. It's like hard to be in this space where you look around and see all of the contradictions so plainly, and then hear other people denying that those contradictions exist or are just not even aware that they are there in the first place. It's like, it's maddening. It's enough to drive you mad.
Yeah. The thing is, too, like, we're talking about this book because it is so aggressive, and it does take such an aggressive stance, which is part of its appeal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but it's not to say that George Jackson is like ranting and raving here. I mean, he's much of this is
cool and collected.
Yeah, especially his conversation of fascism is like very direct and specific. He's talking about historical events, right? Like real economic history, real political economy, and it's genuine analysis, you know. And it's the kind of people say like you don't need to read to be a Marxist, and there's a part of me that agrees in spirit, at least. But this kind of analysis only comes from that willingness to educate yourself in a way that the status quo will not educate you. And I just think that just has to be acknowledged, you know? I don't care if it sounds elitist or intellectualized or whatever, but like this kind of analysis of fascism comes from understanding where fascism came from. We can't claim to be scientific socialists if we're not going to take that kind of educational process. And I just wanted to say that. I don't know. And I think that this book is a great example because it's not ranting and raving. It's an organized piece.
Yep. It's accessible. It's not written to be above anyone, but it is definitely dealing with the highest level understanding of what is at play.
Yeah.
It's so good.
It's great.
I have a tendency to agree with everything that you just said. Like, I, in spirit, believe that you don't need to read to be a communist, to be a Marxist. You don't need to know the theory to understand what's behind the theory. I agree with that. But also, there's a part of me, and I even made a TikTok and then just never posted it, which was some version of, I will not listen to your criticism of communism unless you've read State and Revolution. Because, like, there's so much of it comes from the propagandized nature of communism. Yeah. So much of the reaction against it comes from just that plain anti-communist propaganda. And the other part of it does come from ignorance, like a failure to understand even just the big picture bits. Like there are clearly details that are not delineated by particular Marxist thinkers or whatever that are still open to interpretation and debate. And that is the work of intellectualism that I recognize its merit, but also I'm not super interested in like getting into the weeds with it, so to speak. You know what I mean? I guess I would be remiss if I didn't point out the block quote that he gives from this Gerasi fellow, because it's basically a fighting strategy for protracted people's war on page 53, because he says the objective is manifold. Yeah. Number 1, threaten the establishment, cause it to panic and make serious tactical mistakes. Number 2, establish the underground revolutionary apparatus, including both active participants and trusted but passive collaborators. So maybe there's some space there for your non-professional revolutionaries.
There you go.
Number 3, to test new recruits in relative security, because infiltration is always going to be a concern.
Yes.
Number 4, demoralize the rank and file and even the officers of the repressive forces. Number 5, panic local capitalists to withdraw their funds from specific areas, hurting the local warlords and politicians who profit from those investments. Number 6, frighten away foreign investors. Number 7, force the U.S. to constantly extend its intervention, which will tax its resources, hence discontent at home, and spread its imperialistic arms, rendering it more vulnerable abroad. Those are all great. And, you know, we've lamented often that, like, we are looking for actual organizational steps that can be taken. This is pretty clear blueprint. Like, for all the times we've said, this isn't a blueprint.
Yeah.
This kind of is.
Yeah. But don't worry, guys. We're not actually talking about the USA, if you're listening, maybe from the authorities.
He tells us that.
We're talking about the maybe the Union of South Africa, perhaps. Exactly. So just to keep that in mind, a lot of this is rhetorical. We're game developers after all. We've been making a video game. You know, check out our app. This is all in Minecraft. So, yeah. But he talks a lot about protracted people's war here, and I think that it's just hand in hand with the kinds of points that we've already made about what it's going to take to exist and survive if your goal is this project, because again, it will be seen as a threat. He lays it out very clearly. If it's small, it'll be laughed off, but as soon as it becomes a medium threat, even it will be repressed, right? The special forces, and then the Marines, and then the National Guard, all of that stuff.
Yep, and he wasn't wrong. I mean, if we look back at the history of the Black Panther Party, he was right.
Yeah, that's my fucking question. Where did the old guard go? What happened? Yeah. I know many of them were killed, obviously, but not all of them. Right?
Killed, imprisoned, defected to Cuba.
That was it. I mean, damn, dude. I hate to think that the structure was so effective, the means of repression were so effective that it just annihilated any organizational drive, any possibility. That's just such a bummer to me to think.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the lesson learned there is the allowance of that repression, that the people saw it happening.
It's what's so tricky about that, though, is you do see that kind of armed resistance. And I know that there is an argument to be made about the way that resistance was organized, the strategies used, the terrorism of it, and all of that. But you did see violence utilized against those forms of repression. And what ultimately happened was that they burned out, The vanguard could not maintain itself. It couldn't sustain itself. How do you avoid that is the question, right? It can't... they were as disciplined as we could get, at the time at least.
Yeah.
With what happened, that's how it ended up. Clearly, they had thinkers that were outlining that kind of violence and the necessity of that organizational structure. They had training, they had discipline.
Yeah.
And it still was obliterated.
The point that I was trying to make there is that it never expanded to a large enough mass of people for that to be stopped, for its repression to not be inevitable. And when the repression of the vanguard did happen, when I say the people let it happen, I mean the people not in the vanguard, the masses saw it happening and bought into the propaganda that that they were cop killers or whatever, and let them be imprisoned or do all the different things and just let it happen. So there was still a lack of consciousness or something among the people.
Maybe the racial divide was too great. I mean, George Jackson really is clear that he says racism is the main hurdle to our organization right now.
Yeah.
And it's I'm absolutely willing to accept that. The question is have we moved past that? That's that question again. We're not post-racism.
Yeah.
Is racism... It is a hurdle. Obviously, the question is how big of a hurdle is it still?
Yeah, he says on 111, he names the 3 types of white racists.
Yes.
Because he says the major obstacle to a unified left in this country is white racism. There are 3 categories of white racists. The overt, self-satisfied racist who doesn't attempt to hide his antipathy. The self-interdicting racist who harbors and nurtures racism in spite of his best efforts. And the unconscious racist who has no awareness of his racist preconceptions. I don't have comment other than I think that's very astute.
Yes.
I also think that it is indicative that Jackson recognized that racism was still the primary hurdle with unifying the left. He talks about the Weathermen a couple of times in this book and how they eventually dissolved.
I didn't send it to you on TikTok, but I saw a video of Fred Hampton criticizing the Weathermen for being undisciplined and unorganized, and maybe it's that kind of undirected violence that they're talking about.
But the question of have we moved past that being the primary hurdle?
Yeah.
I don't know. There's still a lot of fucking stupid conversations on the left around issues of identity and dismissive attitudes toward elitist white intellectuals who think their shit doesn't stink.
Just thinking about that discussion again, he says, I deny the existence of black racism outright.
Yeah. It's fundamentally unfair to expect the black man to differentiate at a glance between the various kinds of white races.
Yeah, that's the best way to put it. It's like
sensitive white folks that get upset when they're like, why are you talking to me like that? Why are you regarding me like that? I'm not a racist or whatever. It's how the fuck do they know?
Right.
Sorry also for breaking the seal on this being a no fuck episode. I think I was the first one to do it.
Have I said fuck already?
You might have.
I probably have.
I definitely have. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Sorry, Will's mom.
I knew when we were reading this that it was impossible. This is not a fuckless book, man.
Oh, no, not at all.
It'll get you heated. I think one huge thing, let's just take it to page 119, because when we're thinking about the steps being taken, we've talked a lot about political action that is ultimately ameliorative, right? We've been talking about action that relieves, and we've also even talked about support, and we've talked about it as communists, even, of like political parties as a means of making the status quo of the working class better, right? I advocated for Kamala because, essentially, by omission, I should say, I advocated for voting for Kamala because it was a better status quo than Donald Trump or whatever, regardless. And something that George Jackson says that is quite striking is that reform is fascism. I think that was a real point that could be maybe a little contentious. I love everything on page 118 and 119. The thing is that crisis was allowed to reform itself. With each reform, revolution became more remote. This is because the old left has failed to understand the true nature of fascism. So again, we're still having those old debates about fascism. And he says that we'll never have a complete definition of fascism. Eventually, the closest thing we can get, though, the word would be reform. Each economic reform that perpetuates ruling class hegemony has to be disguised as positive gain for the upthrusting masses. To allow a sizable portion of the new state to participate in this flea market, the ruling class has established currency controls and minimum wage laws. Like the way that the state has involved itself and has been able to essentially create these striations in the hierarchy, it allows our class to fight itself. Okay, and he's saying like that reformism is a means of fascistic control that the government is imposing upon us, and it's a means of ameliorating their own revolutionary pressures against them. And I think that that's such an interesting argument because it ties really well into the idea that action needs to be taken right now. It's not enough to say like we're organizing to try to take care of things, to build consciousness, to expand our organization. Because that's missing the fact that anything that is allowing the hegemonic levers of power to be utilized against the masses to prevent your organization is counter-revolutionary. That's exactly right. And I think that that's such an interesting way to talk about it, because I am always in favor of something that's going to make conditions right now better. But I think you just have to acknowledge at the very least that kind of action is not revolutionary in any sense. It's really to drive the nail home that like to do a revolutionary action is to take it a step further than that. You cannot just be in favor of doing that kind of thing. And it also is the acknowledgement that sometimes at least seeking out that kind of amelioration is counter-revolutionary. And I think that that's a big deal, because you can't always do what you want, or even necessarily what you might support morally, if your goal is this kind of broad upheaval. That might sound even a little too leaning into an apologetic thing, but I think, it's important to square that with yourself, that what you think might be the best solution is not necessarily the best solution revolutionarily. You know what I mean? And that resonated with me because I voted blue no matter who this year, and looky what fucking happened. So,
well, we both voted for president, and only one of us had a vote that counted, so.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, fascism, the most advanced form, is here in America. He thinks a lot of people are fascist, and I think it might be a little historically contentious, But if you're taking the reform fascism lens, the reformist fascist, that's what I'll term that, the reformist fascist lens, then yeah, I guess you could agree with him, and I understood his argument at the very least, even if I didn't agree with it. But he name drops a lot of really interesting people, some interesting history. He talks about revolutionary brigades, fascist brigades. There's a fantastic revolutionary view of history for how fascism was developed in Italy. Like I said already, I think it's really interesting to think that the reason that fascism was able to utilize populist appeal was the fact that Mussolini was studied in the kind of scientific revolutionary organization that was put forth by Lenin.
Yeah, he brings that up in here.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, he also says, Juan Perón was a fascist in Argentina. I don't know how familiar you are with Argentinian history. It's so funny reading on Wikipedia about Juan Perón. It's like there are some very progressive elements of Peronism, and there are some very rightist elements of Peronism. People might describe him as socialist, but they might think of that as national socialist. And I'm like, interesting way to put that. So I don't know enough about Perón to give my opinion here, but sure, I'll agree with you, George Jackson, that he was a fascist. But on top of that, that wasn't the most reformist fascist. That was FDR.
Yeah.
You know, John Maynard Keynes, actually, both of those people, hardcore interventionist, reformist fascists, because they allowed for the intervention structure. You know, and I think that there is interesting. I'd love to know, and listener, you might know, in which case you should email us at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com. Where can I read an updated economic analysis in this vein? It's interesting to think that he's talking about the reform of fascism into an interventionist structure here, because what's interesting is that in the neoliberal model is that we got rid of that interventionist structure, right? We privatized and we went back to a laissez-faire kind of archetype, you know, kind of a deregulatory structure, or at least that was the conservative ideal. So, you know, maybe the sequel to this lies in a history of neoliberalism. That's the next step in the economic history of reformist fascism. You know, if we're going to take George Jackson's lens on what fascism is, which I do. I mean,
I would say I largely do as well.
I feel quite gratified reading this because it reminds me of a lot of the shit I've already said on this. Some stuff which, you know, upon review at first glance, I felt was kind of a little preposterous even, you know? Like, I've spoken quite freely about fascism in America, and I think that he also feels, you know, I feel quite aligned with George Jackson on his view of American fascism. So I think to see what an updated look at that timeline might lie in a history of neoliberalism, because we immediately shifted off this interventionist type policy in the 80s, and look what happened, man. We got fucking Reagan, the goddamn slasher. Like,
there's one more thing I want to point out on 108, because he's talking about the prisoner class here and the supposed revolutionary potential of radicalized prisoners. And I thought it was a fascinating idea and lends to one of the questions that I'm going to have later. But he says that prisoners must be reached and made to understand that they are victims of social injustice, and that my persuasion is that the war goes on no matter where one may find himself on bourgeois-dominated soil. The sheer numbers of the prisoner class and the terms of their existence make them a mighty reservoir of revolutionary potential. And I don't know, I think a lot of folks on the left, or pointed toward the left of center, have at least a sympathetic view of prisoners and recognize the need for systemic reform of the prison industrial complex, but are still not seeing the potential that's there. For folks that are deliberately marginalized by at the hands of capital, because he even talks earlier about crime as being the first form of rebellion.
Yes.
Because it's a reaction to the kind of socio-psycho fetters of capitalism, you know, putting their fingers in. This is a weird fucking way to say it, but like the socio-psycho reaction to living under the boot of capitalism.
Yeah.
Crime is often the first form of rebellion against that. And there's something there that has true revolutionary potential. I mean, he was obviously writing this from inside of prison and saw it firsthand, and also was probably speaking from some of his own experience. But I think that is something that is, I don't hear enough people also bringing up.
It's an extension of his own message, you know. If you, as George Jackson believes, think that we should be building a structure which, for lack of better words, invites repression so that people can see the repression of the state firsthand, then you should be talking to people who see the repression of the state firsthand.
Yeah.
Right? And, like, those are prisoners, you know? And maybe they don't, like George Jackson at first did not understand that the impetus for their rebellion was one that was economically based, but they can see, you know? Clearly, someone can go into the prison system even and come out on the other end fiercely revolutionary, right? And so if you believe that, like I do, like George Jackson does, then you should put your money where your mouth is, for lack of better words. It's just a question of like how you organize that, especially because, like we said, how did he get these books? Not that I'm saying someone mailed him these books, but like you could never get these books in jail today. They're banned, certainly.
Yeah, I would imagine.
I mean, I follow people on Twitter that have been sent to jail recently for their protests and their kind of actions. So people that I consider to be revolutionaries. And they've said, like, here are books that I was not able to receive. A lot of these they got and said that this is commie trash, and they put to the side. I got it when I was released. Others they got and just threw away, you know? And it's like, how did you get this material? How do you reach those people? That's a question that has to be reckoned with. It's the Cavalcade of Quotes.
Cavalcade of quotes.
Yeah. Here's a great one. When the white self-congratulatory racist complains that the blacks are uncouth, unlettered, that our areas are run down, not maintained, that we dress with loud tastelessness, a thing they now also say about their own children, he forgets that he governs. He forgets that he built the schools that are inadequate, and he has abused his responsibility to use taxes paid by blacks to improve their living conditions, that he manufactured the loud pants and pointed shoes that destroy and deform the feet. What else can you say? That's hand in hand, man. We should read Gramsci, you know? I want a more structured look at how hegemony is used to control people outside of purely economic intervention, just like we were talking about a second ago. I think that that's a huge part of the modern day psychosocial effects that make or prevent revolution. That's really it. It's like we set it up the way we set it up. We can't be complaining about the state of the concentration camps that we set up. You know, sorry.
That actually kind of leads to what I wanted to point out as my first quote for the Cavalcade on page 99, where he tells us that the ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison.
It's a great one. Yeah, on page 97. It is true, even the official figures prove the case against capitalism. I have the figures as it states them right here. Vital statistics, FBI crime report. Property crimes, 87% of the total in 1969. You know, I love that view. It's like, yeah, if we want to get rid of all the property crimes, why don't we just get rid of property? You know, why focus on the crimes? What kind of crimes are they again? Oh, property crimes, you say? Oh, what crime? Property crime?
I also just found the quote from the beginning of the show that I've probably cut out any indication that I was searching for back then, but on 101,
okay,
talking about the August 7th movement, he says, proof of the role of law within the totalitarian-authoritarian relationship was also built into the action. In a fit of reckless, mindless gunfire, 100 automated goons shot through the bodies of a judge, district attorney, and 3 female non-combatants to reestablish control over all activity. To prevent certain actions, no cost in blood is too high. You know, it's only murder when it's not the state pulling the trigger, you know.
Exactly. Right? Because those people were killed, right? That would be the headline.
Passive voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. 4 dead.
I mean, I really hate to put a timestamp on when this show is recorded, but like, man, you see it in the fucking Israel stuff.
Yeah.
Even in the hostage exchange, you know, the fact that it's 4 Israeli hostages versus 100 Palestinian prisoners.
Yep.
You're telling me that you're swapping 4 people for 100 people? Who's really got the hostages here?
Yeah.
If we're talking about women and children, right? You've got 100 of them in a prison. They've got 4, and their side is the hostages. I can't say it any clearer than that.
Yeah, such fucking bullshit.
I have a great one on 168. Just like you said, you know, the actual personification of law is actually the prison, right? Every time I hear the word law, I visualize gangs of militiamen or Pinkertons busting strikes, pigs wearing sheets and caps that fit over their pointed heads. I see a white oak and a barefooted black hanging, or snake eyes peeping down the lenses of telescopic rifles or conspiracy trials. Very good.
Yeah, on point. It's hard not to just go through for the Cavalcade. I expressed concern at the beginning of this recording to Will off mic that this episode was going to go on forever because it's really difficult to not just go page by page and point out every amazing quote that he has.
Yeah, part of my process is I just go through and I look at everything that I highlighted, and I always end up with something like every page, every other page, you know, and it's not always, when I read them, it's like, I don't think we're ever going to be able to talk about this, but this book is beautifully written. There's so many banger lines in there. Like, I love on 34 here, just to talk about the necessity of violence, right? He says, violence is not supposed to work in America. All Americas in this book are with a K instead of a C, by the way. Shoutouts to Maoist Standardist English. I love America with 3 Ks. That's the bomb. So violence is not supposed to work in America. For no one, that is, except for the omnipotent administrator. But this is yet to be proved to my satisfaction, since I know that a bomb is a bomb is a bomb.
Yep.
Right? It's violence at the end of the day. Political power comes from the end of a gun.
Yep. A bullet fired from an assault rifle in the hands of a Vietnamese liberation fighter will kill a pig in Vietnam. Why won't it kill a pig in the place where pigs are made?
Right, exactly. And, you know, again, to think about a war with the state, like war is a daunting thing, right? But when it comes to the guerrilla war, the advantage is that we are a whole people. There are real organizational notes in here. He says that in the guerrilla war studies out there, it requires 10 police per one guerrilla. That's a great advantage to have. And it's not about tank versus tank combat. It's about the fact that any guy on the corner could have a gun in his pocket. And this is more true today than ever before, right? We don't even have to have like metal machining tools to be able to, allegedly, there are things, yeah, we'll just leave it at that.
Yep.
It's going to be tough to see how many clips from this episode survive on TikTok. I'll tell you that much.
The new TikTok, especially.
Yeah, dude, what's up with that? I keep hearing it's like, oh, the meta servers and there's the no algorithm, and I don't know, man.
The interesting thing that I noticed is after the 17 hours that it was down or whatever, in the interim, I got on Facebook and I was prompted to connect it to my TikTok account. And I was like, in what world has one corporation asked you to link to another competing corporation? It seemed very strange to me. And then when TikTok came back, you got all of the people talking about blocking Facebook and Instagram and all the meta stuff to get back to the, quote, old TikTok or whatever, because it's changed their For You page.
Doesn't make any sense to me.
I don't know. It's all fucking weird. It
Yeah.
was all clearly a grift.
I mean, maybe they just like, I don't know. It's not worth talking about.
You're seeing posts from TikTok all the time now about people being flagged for things now, like even just saying Free Palestine.
Yeah, I did see that.
Anyway.
That's like, I mean, but another great example of those fucking hegemonic controls.
Yep.
Right? Even if we're not saying that like the government has direct influence on TikTok, it's clearly they do. In their threat to ban it, they've forced some sort of change. Yeah. So threats of violence do work, believe it or not.
Yeah, and in response to that on 45, waiting passively for the final verdict of history is not making revolution. Yet another call to action about the immediacy of the need to do something.
Just one page over. When Jonathan steps forward with his anti-Nixon rocket launcher, there should be 9 more like himself with assault rifles to close an exit path for him. That's so good. Yeah, and this is actually what I was talking about earlier. And there should be a political infrastructure, a cadre not far away to explain his actions, to glean from them the greatest overall political effect. It's like our methods are outdated, you know? It's not just about the rallies, but then going among the people in the rallies and seeing literally what they can contribute, you know?
Yeah.
That's that like talking to your neighbor shit that's like uncomfortable to think about, but it's really what needs to happen.
I've really been giving that a lot of thought since the last episode as well, because I was decrying that as like a piece of advice, like no, talk to your neighbors kind of thing.
It's not that it's bad advice. It's just that kind of action needs to, I mean...
It feels decontextualized to just say like talk to your neighbors.
Talk to your neighbor. About like, what is really important, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that there's other ways to do that too. Like... We were talking about, just to bring it kind of full circle to what we started this episode with, is like, how long is too long a plan? What do you do? I don't think the organizational structures here have a military cadre necessarily. I don't think the organizations that we currently have have a secret military branch ready to do the kind of action that might need to be done to further a revolutionary cause. I don't need to mince my words any more than that.
I would go even further to say that I think the reason we've been so hard on organization in our area lately is because you can make the argument that they're trying to establish methods of dual power. They're trying to establish what we see as ameliorative responses could be argued to be the foundation of dual power systems being built. But what I still think is valid is that there is still no clear organization galvanizing this, you know, like you said, walking through the marches and finding the things that people can contribute to the cause.
Yeah.
Galvanizing people in that sort of way and building a larger mass movement around the organization that doesn't even need to get into the armed military branch, that is still firmly planted in the political side and even to a degree removed from that.
Yes.
Like I talk about building furniture. Like there's nothing political inherently about building a fucking table. The only political part of it is the way that table is distributed to others. And like, where is that? Where is that? The seizing of the anger, the discomfort of people in the area, in the community, and like building an organization around that.
You know, I mean, ultimately, just to take a step back from such a specific thing, it's like ultimately if the goal of this project is to seize the means of production, then we should be producing means of production, like we should be creating local structures. And I hate to sound so granular, like that's just what needs to happen. Everyone, 600,000 people need to all step forward and start building furniture and, making bathtub penicillin or whatever the fuck.
Always with the bathtub penicillin.
It's just such low-hanging fruit. But is that what it takes? Is that what it's going to take to actually do this kind of thing? To think about an end goal is like that. Is that what is going to have to happen? It's like just buying a bunch of land, creating shops and places that community people can come work at, and then trying to foster that class consciousness, and then praying that you can grow as big as you can before military action is required, and then maybe when military action is required, seeing what has to happen from that point. You know what I mean? Like, is that what we're going to have to do at this point is fucking start a fucking commune, Like, he talks about the construction of the black commune throughout America, and it's like, that's the thing. We have to go and build the commune, and I'm saying we broadly here, but is it also like, is that what we have to fucking do?
Yeah.
Is that what we have to go buy a big fucking plot of land and say, all right, we'll start by growing all the food we can to sustain ourselves to ensure our survival, and then spread out what our means.
Yeah. And that's the whole purpose of building dual power, is to create those structures. Back to our unwillingness to give up our comfort. If you can build dual power to a point where you can provide those needs, it's no longer discomforting to divest from the state apparatus that's providing them otherwise.
Yeah. To say survival, I think, adds a connotation of very like bleak, barren.
Yeah.
Survival means comfort, ultimately. Whether that's your comfort to live or your comfort for other means, like your definition of survival can mean a lot of things. But if you're building alternate institutions that are there for your survival, that ultimately means for your comfort, right?
Exactly. That's just hierarchy of needs shit.
Yeah. So if you're interested in joining our commune, you can let us know at leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
Exactly. He uses this excellent metaphor on 83.
Yeah.
The cannon was hit at its base in the moving parts of its treads, which were destroyed, and the death machine fell of its own weight. One, as a former English teacher, just a beautiful metaphor, but two, an incredible explanation of the $2 worth of materials destroying the $1,000 tank that you brought up earlier. Like, it doesn't matter how powerful that machine is, if you can stop it from moving, it's useless.
Just to tie back to the real world again, man, the military strategy that Israel has ultimately taken in Gaza and in Palestine in the past, you can see is a reflection of their fear of the insurrectionary nature of the Palestinian movement. They're very focused on armor supportive infantry because that infantry has to be protected from constant threat, and if that means like getting into armored vehicles in order to prevent like small arms fire, it literally, their fascist structure has been formed by the actions of the insurrection, and it's just an example of the fact that your strategy, your action has consequence on the powers that be. You do have an effect on the people oppressing you.
Yeah, and we didn't even really talk about this, but Jackson does talk about how the revolution in the United States would be an urban revolution.
Yes.
It wouldn't be agrarian like revolutions of the past, and that would change our tactics. That would change the game. And he was talking about that as a great pool of value and strength for the guerrillas fighting that.
Yeah.
Because it completely changes the way what the response would look like.
I've seen some argument online, because I'm just online a lot. Sorry. I've seen some argument online that FOCO theory was a failure outside of Cuba. In fact, that the attempt to implement FOCO theory in Bolivia is what got Che Guevara killed. He was able to be overwhelmed by the state structure because it was not able to connect to popular support. I don't necessarily think that was a consequence of the things that make FOCO theory unique, like having small militant cadre. Like I'm not sure. I don't know the specifics, but
Nor I.
It's just interesting to think about that you really have to connect to the masses ultimately. Yeah, it just goes back to building those institutions. Like, what does that even look like? What is actually necessary for our survival?
I still have a few more. I don't know if you have
I
one.
had a great one that really cracked me up on page 28. He says at the bottom, George Wallace or Adolf Hitler would fare better at the polls of an honest election than Huey Newton or Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden, very funny because he went on to go into politics and win. Yeah, he was a governor. He was a senator, I think. He was some kind of political representative. I should have figured out the actual one.
Congressperson, maybe.
I just thought it was really funny because he did in fact go into an election and win.
That's funny. How about this one on 157? The trappings of this pseudo-mass society are empty, cheap, spectacular leisure sports, parades where strangers meet, shout each other down, and often trample each other to death on the way home, mass consumption of worthless super suds or aspirin, ritualistic, ultra-nationalistic events on days to glorify the idiots who died at war, or other days to deify those who sent them out to die. A mass society that is actually a mass jungle.
Yeah.
I just wrote, where's the lie?
Where's the lie? We'll build these communes with pamphlet in one hand, gun in the other. I like that. I love just on 177, because again, it's hard to feel this book, especially if you agree with Jackson, and not to feel extreme. But he says, I am an extremist, a communist. Not communistic, a communist. Okay? And I must be destroyed, or I will join my comrades in the only communist party in this country, the Black Panther Party. And, man, that's just a bummer. It's just a bummer.
That's actually right above the one that I wanted to close with.
Yeah.
Well established on the show, I won't belabor the point. I have trouble with fatalism, so anything that provides me revolutionary optimism is very welcome. And I loved this quote right under that where he says that he's an extremist. He says, "Nothing will defeat our revenge, and nothing will countervail our march to victory. We come to our conclusion, the only historical recourse that is left to us." I just love that. I could hear the trumpets swelling behind it, you know.
Action now, man. I mean...
So anyway, that was Blood in My Eye by George L. Jackson.
Really, really fucking good piece.
Yeah.
What questions did you have?
I did have a couple. And the first to start is, I would just like clarity. I would like you as my reading partner to maybe help me understand exactly what he means here.
Sure.
And it ties back to something that you pointed to earlier. So this goes to 110 because he says, "We must renounce the idea that all participants must be of one mind and should work at the problem from a single party line, or with a single party line, or with a single method. The reverse of this is actually desirable, from all according to ability." Now he does go on, further down the page to say democratic centralism is the only way to deal effectively with the American ordeal, but I'm a little confused by that. The idea that we don't need a party line, we don't need to come at this from one idea. Isn't this like counter to the mass line? Isn't this out of alignment with the mass line?
I think... Well, no, I see exactly what you're saying. I think that he's being more pragmatic with his approach in the way that Lenin does, too, where he says that a coalition is the only way possible for us to have achieved political power. It's just that at the end of the day, they knew what the ideal needed to be. They knew that the point of this was revolution. And it's very clear that he is against reformist attitudes, opportunistic attitudes, adventurous attitudes, all of these things.
For sure.
And I think that that's what, if you are amenable to everything he said here, then you can work with this guy. That's really part of it. You can join that organization, that one party. That's the kind of party that's desirable, is to take everyone in and then to work the mass line, to go to the people where they're at and to organize around them, to meet their needs, to ensure their survival, and to build that organization and expand it out, to have the defense necessary to survive and to continue. Yeah. That's really how I can square that circle, right? Is because I do agree. I do agree that it's a little contradictory, right? But the thing is, it's like, even democratic centralism, if you're thinking about it as diversity of thought, unity of action, we can have many, many different people involved. It's just as long as everyone is willing to accept one decision, right? One action. He said he describes it as Unitarian. It's like we're moving as one force here. Even if we're coming from a lot of different backgrounds. I really just think that that's the best way to look at it. And it's the kind of coalition that we're already searching for as communists.
Yeah, and it's the most logical way to approach building coalition at all. You're not coming at it like, are you one of ironclad discipline and spirit?
Are you a Marxist, Leninist, Titoist, Maoist, Fanonist like me? Yeah. Like, to show me your labels, show me your communist pins. Let's see if we can fucking connect. It's like, no. If you believe in action now for the purpose of the dissolution of all hierarchy, class, wages, money, all of that shit, then let's talk, Okay,
good. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing or misinterpreting something there, because it just seemed a little...
No, I don't think there's anything contradictory in his... I don't think there's anything contradictory in his argument there.
Okay.
My big question was, what happened to the old guard? Aside from all the ones that got killed, it felt like they were so close, you
Yeah.
know? And I know that there's a more sober analysis of the era possible, but what happened? That's the biggest question I have here because, as I said before, I find it harder to disagree with any of this stuff in its ideas or its calls to action.
Yeah. I think that's a fair question. And I think a question that we have raised in one form or another a few times on the show.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it seems like we're punching toward, like Angela Davis in particular, as an example of someone who was clearly a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And Jackson is very, very positive toward.
The gun that allegedly George Jackson had registered to Angela Davis.
Yeah.
So.
And then how do you go from being a revolutionary held up in the highest esteem of other revolutionaries like Newton and Jackson
To a
fucking
Hillary
standing on
supporter,
stage
yeah.
with Hillary Clinton? Like, how does that happen? It's like forced assimilation or something. It's like the subsumation of revolutionary thought into neoliberal.
Yeah, did you just give up? Like, was it co-opted? Like,
Yeah.
do you still feel like a revolutionary? I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that Angela Davis has spoken plenty about it too. That's the thing.
Well, and I mean, she's still very outspoken about prison abolition specifically as like a thing. So maybe it's just similar to like what we saw with Marcuse or whatever. It's like they find one thing that narrows their view and all of their efforts go toward that to the point that,
It shuts out any actual other action.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an open question. I don't have the answer.
Yeah, and just because we rag on Angela Davis now too doesn't diminish her historical contribution either.
Oh, in no way.
There's plenty fine about Angela Davis. She's a a big, bold, revolutionary woman. Isn't
Yeah.
that what he says?
Yeah.
Okay.
That kind of opens the door to this conversation around like, I don't know what you would call it, like purity politics or something that permeates a lot of the left. That
Yeah.
you have to be like a perfect paragon of everything in order for anything you've ever done to be taken seriously
Sure.
or considered, which is bonkers. My question about Angela Davis specifically in the present has no bearing on my attitude toward the Angela Davis of the past. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
I don't know. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I have another practical question, not
Sure.
a big abstract question, and it's related to something on 113, actually.
Okay.
Because he uses a phrase, he says, there must be a collective redirection of the old guard, the factory and the union agitator with a campus activist who can counter the ill effects of fascism at its training site, and with the lumpen proletariat intellectuals who possess revolutionary scientific socialist attitudes to deal with the masses of street people already living outside of the system. Okay. Lumpen proletariat intellectuals, question mark. Here's something that we talked about lumpen proletariat a little bit on the last episode, and I had an elementary, meaning far too broad, understanding of it when I first encountered the word, and I felt like I was narrowing my understanding of what it meant, and now lumpen proletariat intellectuals, like, is there an actual definition of lumpen proletariat somewhere that's useful? I'm still searching for it.
Man, I think it's like the Supreme Court definition of pornography, where you just,
I know
when I see it. That's exactly right. Because I think that I can definitely envision what George Jackson means when he says lumpen proletariat individuals, because I love earlier when he's talking about, I forgot about this quote in the Cavalcade, so I'm glad I get to talk about it now, where he's talking about all the different ways to survive being interrogated, and he says a peasant philosopher face will work. A peasant philosopher, that's exactly what he means. And I think that is leaning a little more towards the broad and inclusive definition, someone abstracted from class consciousness. But, I can understand that. And it's the people that, man, the problem is I don't want to name someone specific and be like, that's the kind of person we're talking about. But I'm just thinking about Bill Burr, the kind of person who's clearly someone who is thinking. Someone who's not so fucking bought into the status quo, Because the thing is, the lumpen proletariat, in a more strict definition, I think, is a class that exists to uphold the status quo. It's to serve as almost like an overseer. You know what I mean? It's like a violent strata that exists as almost an outreach element of the ruling class on the ground level, like the fucking black shirts, man, a physical arm. I think that there's, the intellectual class of that strata is possible, like the intelligentsia of the lumpen proletariat, So I'm willing to expand my definition enough to make that work.
Okay. I mean, this is like, I understand everything that you just said, and I agree.
It's just it's nebulous.
Yeah, there's just some, I don't know. I also feel a little bit like I'm always walking on eggshells because back to the kind of purity politics thing, like you say one thing or get one thing wrong or have a misunderstanding. I feel like communists are the most aggressive little catty bitches to call you out on stuff.
You know what? But you have to set the definition.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
That's right. That's exactly right. You know, because if at the end of the day those people are so far removed from our program ultimately that they might be fascists, then we need to be the ones setting the definition, not them. That's what I mean by that.
Well said.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, well, so you should read this book if you have eyes.
Yeah, you should read this book if you haven't.
Yeah. But maybe a little bit more directed than that, because really the answer is everyone should read this book. But like you said, this is a book that might be hard to recommend to every person.
Yes.
Right? So I think you should read this book if...
I think you should read this book if you need a revolutionary call to action.
That's kind of what I was trying to get at. Yeah. If you recognize that something must be done and you're just sitting in disquietude, not sure what it is.
Yeah, and if you're someone, and this might be a little bit more of an imperative statement, but you should read this book if you feel that this is a really long-term project. If you're feeling that this is a distant future, out of your lifetime thing, if you think of revolution as something that is for another generation, I think you should read this book.
I need that reminder often.
As do I, because as much as I would just want to go buy a stretch of land and live on my own personal commune.
That's eco-fascist.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, too close to the fucking small yeoman farmer ideal that I think still permeates the fascist American project and has since its inception.
Everyone should read this book. That's the answer. You should read this book if you're alive.
Yeah. Even if you have read this book, you should read it.
You should read it again.
You should read it again. Just give you a refresher.
The most immediate call to action I feel after reading this book is to read Soledad Brother.
I literally feel the same.
Yeah.
I really want to read Soledad Brother as well.
Yeah.
So, Aaron, what are we reading next?
Next up, we are beginning the monumental task of reading Capital.
Yes.
By Karl Marx. We're going to read Chapter 1.
It's time, okay? There's a new translation out. A lot of people are reading it. Discussion abound. Join us. We're reading Capital.
Yes, won't you please? Any further recommendations for reading can be sent to us at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yes, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know what else you are interested in reading alongside us. Give us any feedback you have on the show. Would love to hear from you. I said it already. And, yeah.
And don't get left unread.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.